Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, host of Kinda Murdery, a podcast that's about more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories. The unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery.
Hey everybody, welcome to Kinda Murdery. I am Zevin Odelberg, and I am glad you're here. You have found your way to Part 2 of A Cry from the Grave. So, if you haven't heard Part 1 yet, go back and listen to it. Then rejoin us. We'll save you a seat. And if you're all caught up, then I'm not gonna dilly-dally. If you'll remember, Super-sleuth Ellis H. Parker and the police have just returned to the lively basement for a third time in search of Matilda's body. That's where we are. So let's get to it. I'm so glad you're here with me as we uncover what truths we can and solve what mysteries we may. Kinda Murderies, A Cry from the Grave, Part 2, starts now. The two policemen got a spade and Chief Bradshaw dug feverishly while Officer Jacobs looked through the displaced earth for a bit of clothing or anything suspicious. Nothing was found. Was this effort to result in nothing? Still, they dug on. A depth of 3 feet had been reached. Suddenly, the spade struck something soft. Dropping to their knees, the officers removed the earth rapidly with their hands. There lay the mutilated body of Matilda Russo. Every stitch of clothing had been removed, most of it had been buried with the body. The girl had been ripped open in the stomach and throat and struck twice on the head, once on the forehead and once behind, and had been criminally assaulted. Large clots of blood were in the grave, clear indication that it had been prepared for her beforehand and that the body had been placed there while it was still warm. Now, to pause for a moment, you will notice that I made my actual presence scarce in Moorestown. I had a reason for this. My face was a very familiar one there at the time because just prior to Matilda's disappearance I had worked on several murder mysteries near Moorestown. I figured from the beginning that if I were seen around too much, the slayer of the girl, if she had been slain, would take the hint and disappear. I calculated correctly that to direct operations from Mount Holly was the proper course for me to pursue. I had told Chief Bradshaw to call me immediately if he found anything in that cellar, but no matter how important the news was, he was not to break anything over the phone. A man I had once wanted listened in on a telephone conversation of mine, and once is plenty. So, after making the gruesome discovery, Mr. Bradshaw merely called and said, "Come right away, Ellis." A hint, of course, at this stage of the game was equivalent to a ton of bricks. I knew what awaited me in Moorestown. So, Detective Kane, my secretary, and I were soon headed toward the scene at, to say the least, breakneck speed. Arriving in Moorestown, we went directly to the lively home where the two officers awaited us. My secretary remained upstairs. Officer Jacobs guarded the home. Detective Kane, Chief Bradshaw, and I descended the cellar steps. One look at the body convinced me that here was one of the most terrifying and fiendish crimes that I had ever encountered. We left Matilda's body in the cellar and held a conference on the first floor. After the conference, when we were leaving the house by the front door, the latch broke. This made it impossible to keep the door from swinging open. It was quite essential that it be closed because the poor girl's body had created quite a stench in the small house, and if the place were not securely closed, we knew that passers-by would detect the odor, investigate, and the crime would be disclosed. We were anxious to keep our discovery secret, knowing that the slayer was probably keeping a close watch on the newspapers, and if he saw the report of the finding of the body, he would flee at once. So we went back into the place and nailed the door, making our exit through a window. At this stage of the game, the finger of suspicion pointed pretty definitely to Lively, so we decided to nab Lively on sight. We called the brush factory where he was employed, but they returned the information that he hadn't been in that day. Not having any idea where to look for him, we decided that Chief Bradshaw and Officer Jacobs should lie in wait until he returned home that night. We were not anxious to arrest him in Philadelphia anyway on account of the extradition problem. I went to police headquarters with Mr. Kane and my secretary. While awaiting word of Lively's return home, I looked up the man's record through the Philadelphia Police Department, and what a record it was. He was born in South Jersey and as a boy was sent to the reformatory at Rahway, New Jersey for arson. After his release from Rahway, he was employed by a farmer at Dayton, New Jersey, but he was shortly sent to the state prison for 14 years for a serious crime. His next encounter with the police was when he murdered a man named Madden in a brawl in Philadelphia. He drew a 2-year term in the Eastern Penitentiary for this. After his release, he changed his name from Roberts to Lively and married. It was while in prison that Lively learned brushmaking. At the time of the murder, he had lived in Moorestown for only a few months and was well thought of by the neighbors who lived nearby. Lively's house was only a half a block from the East Moorestown Railroad Station. The trolley line ran right by his place. We had both the trolley and the railroad station covered, but when he came home that night, he got off the trolley 2 blocks from his house, sneaked around the back way under cover of darkness, and tried the front door. Then, he vanished the instant he found that the door had been tampered with. Aided by the darkness of the night, he slipped right through the hands of the officers lying in wait for him. This we found out to our sorrow later. A peculiar circumstance in this case was that so far we had not even suspected Lively of any connection with the Russo case until after it was too late. There was no doubt in my mind now, however, that the man had committed the murder, but how could we have arrested him before finding the body? What would we have charged him with? Until the body was found, we did not have any proof or even any indications that the little girl had been slain. For all we knew, she might have been drowned or kidnapped or, better still, just lost. The fact that Lively remained at his home for so long after the crime threw us off the scent. And right here I want to take the time to point out that the slayer did one of the neatest track covering jobs I have ever heard of. He had lifted cobwebs from another pile of rubbish and carefully placed them on the pile of cans over the grave, giving the refuse all the appearance of having been there untouched for a long time. And if you don't think this is a hard feat to accomplish, just try it yourself sometime. There isn't a criminal in 1,000 who would even think of such a thing, let alone plan and execute it successfully. In addition, the fiend had also fooled us in another way. The aged-looking pillows which oozed out their stuffings were really comparatively new pillows we found upon close scrutiny. He had dragged them around the cellar floor and had torn them to make them look old. And what a slick job he made of it. As for the footprints or any other evidence of his having been in the cellar, well, everything had been completely obliterated. That night, around 8 o'clock, a black woman walked into a room adjoining police headquarters at the Moorestown City Hall. My secretary was the only one in the room at the time. The woman asked Miss Hughes if Louis Lively had been arrested, and my secretary at once became suspicious. She excused herself for a moment and rushed into another room and told someone to call me in a hurry. She then went back and engaged the woman in what must have been a charming conversation, for she held her, against her will, until I arrived. The woman was Mrs. Lively, and I at once detained her. That smart move on the part of Miss Hughes helped materially in clearing up the mystery. Although Mrs. Lively denied any knowledge of the crime, we knew that our best play was to detain her. Now, to return to Lively. We checked up at the railroad trolley and the ferry stations for miles around to see if he had bought a ticket for anywhere. We found out exactly nothing. I then had a flyer printed saying I wanted the man for murder. This was sent in the usual fashion to every police department in this country and Canada. Lively was only 5 feet 2 inches in height, and we thought that his small stature would aid in his capture, never realizing that he would convert it to his own advantage by a clever trick. I had a hunch that Lively, wherever he might be, would seek employment as a brushmaker, so I had a talk with President Fernley of the Brush Manufacturers Association of the United States and Canada. Mr. Fernley had in his possession the names and addresses of all the leading concerns in the brush line and suggested that a photograph and description of Lively be sent to all of them, coupled with instructions that if the man applied for work he was to be detained and the police notified. Fernley's idea was a smart one, and I agreed to it immediately, and the plan was carried out. Police headquarters of various cities were also notified to this angle of the search. As luck would have it, a brush company in Boston, after receiving the notice, at once communicated with the Hub City Police Headquarters, who in turn relayed the information to me to the effect that Lively, using one of his many aliases, had applied for a job 2 days before the arrival of the notice. He was told there was nothing available, but to leave an address where he was to be notified if anything turned up. The address was watched, but the police did not make an immediate inquiry. They merely covered the house. They knew that if they asked at the house for Lively and he happened to be out, he would probably be tipped off by telephone and never return. Meanwhile, the brush factory, at my suggestion, sent a letter to Lively telling him there was a job for him. 2 Boston detectives stationed themselves in the factory disguised as workmen, waiting for the fugitive to walk into the trap. But he never showed up. The place where he was supposed to be living was then tackled, but it was found that the man had vanished 2 days before the police vigil began. The next trace of him came from a police officer in a small town up in Maine. He stated that he was riding along in the road in his car when a young fellow stopped him and asked for a lift. The policeman picked up the stranger and the two rode for miles, carrying on a conversation about this, that, and the other thing. During the drive, the officer took a good look at Lively and remarked to him that his face seemed familiar, which was no wonder, for it was plastered up in 1,001 police stations. Lively laughed this off, telling the officer that he must have mistaken him for someone else. Then Lively finally told the policeman he was broke, and the officer arranged a free meal and a bed for the stranger at a tourist camp. He then left the man. The next morning he was dumbfounded when he saw Lively's face on a flyer at the station house. The police went to the place where Lively had spent the night, but the man, as usual, was still 2 jumps ahead of the whole bunch of us. I've never seen a smarter fellow, and on top of this, fate seemed to smile on him. Meanwhile, we were keeping Mrs. Lively in jail for reasons of our own. She had several visitors, and just as soon as these people called, we would question them and get their names, addresses, and any other information possible. One day, an African-American man dropped into my office and asked if he could see Mrs. Lively. Something about the man's demeanor told me that he knew of Louis Lively's whereabouts. I consented to him seeing Mrs. Lively, but I wanted to observe firsthand what went on between the two of them. So I accompanied the visitor to Mrs. Lively's cell. I told him it would be all right for him to talk for as long as he desired with Lively's wife. I remained to hear the conversation. The man, who had told me his home was in Philadelphia, merely walked up to the cell and said, "Hello, Marie, how you feeling? Don't worry. Here's $3 in case you need it. See you later. Goodbye." He saw Mrs. Lively for less than a minute. This struck me as mighty suspicious that a man should come all the way from Philadelphia with so small an amount of money to give her as $3 and then only talk with her for a few seconds. The words, "don't worry," stuck in my mind. I suspected that the stranger's mere presence in the jail was assurance to Mrs. Lively that her husband was communicating with him in some manner. We trailed the man, whose name I won't mention for obvious reasons, and had his mail watched in Philadelphia. All that came through the post office for him was a newspaper from Chase City, Virginia. I got in touch with the postal authorities of the Virginia town and found out that the man had formerly lived with his parents there and had left for Philadelphia only a few months previously. So any mail coming to the home of his parents in Chase City was also watched. All that came for him there were 2 newspapers from Boston. They had no marks of any kind on them, but we figured, and rightly, that they came from Lively, and that they were Lively's way of letting his friends know where he was. I had the man's mother questioned as to whether or not she knew anyone in Boston, and she said she did not. She was unable to say who sent the papers to her son. This clue did not prove a very material way of apprehending Lively, but it gave me my first positive assurance that our suspect was communicating with his wife and other kin in South Jersey. A double strict watch was then focused on all of Lively's friends and relatives. I'll confess that Lively had me guessing all right. I've had a lot of trouble tracking down men and women, but I've yet to run across anyone so cunning and shrewd as he proved to be. During the time that Mrs. Lively was in jail, she struck up quite a friendship with another inmate who was a white woman. Not long after the white woman was released from jail, she walked into my office and asked if she could speak to Mrs. Lively. Her request, of course, was granted at once. They carried on a conversation in a tone of voice so subdued that Detective Kane, secreted in an adjoining cell, could not make out head or tail of what was said. All he could hear was murmuring. We trailed the woman and followed her every action. One night she visited a relative of Lively's in Bridgeton. The following day, she again visited Mrs. Lively in jail. She was observed slipping a note to the prisoner. I decided to let both women have enough rope to hang themselves because I knew that sooner or later, Mrs. Lively's cell would yield information which would lead to the capture of her husband. Finally, after keen observation of the movements of all those interested in Lively, we decided that the time was ripe for a grandstand play. One morning, without warning, we made a sudden search of the jail and found hidden in a corner of one of the cells various scraps of paper which, when pieced together, proved to be what we expected to find. There they were, the notes which Lively had written and which the former woman jail inmate had smuggled through to the hunted man's wife. And, of all things, one of the notes from Lively conveyed the information that, quote, "this thing has about blown over, so I'm gonna slip home soon and see you all," unquote. We found later that the notes had been sent to a relative in Bridgeton, concealed in baskets of grapes. What was going to come next? In addition to the notes, which had been torn up, we also discovered another note which was intact. It was written by Lively to a relative in South Jersey and read in part, "Miss Evelyn, you can look for me at 11:30 tonight. I'm going to make good to you for what you've done for Marie, and you keep an eye open for that Detective Parker." I at once covered all towns in the vicinity of Moorestown, Bridgeton, and Vineland, and laid an elaborate trap for the fugitive. I interviewed employees of the trolley and railroad lines in that section, notifying that Lively was in the immediate neighborhood, and told them to keep a close watch for him. I told them that the man was near at hand because I knew that would spur the watch. Had I said he was expected, the men I talked with would probably have dismissed the matter from their minds, thinking that it would be more or less a wild goose chase. The police, of course, were told the exact facts of the case, for they understood that when I said I was led to believe that Lively would put in an appearance, I meant it. The weeks went by, however, and Lively was still to be apprehended. But something told me, I can't explain my exact mental process, that the man had returned to South Jersey, slipping through the net we had so carefully laid for him. My hunch later proved to be correct, for Lively at that time had already been hiding in Bridgeton for several days. He had managed to elude capture by a clever trick, taking advantage of his diminutive stature and dressing as a woman. Just about daybreak on the morning of October 19th, Asia Wilson and James Florentino, 2 police officers of Vineland, were about to exchange duties at a rather remote spot on the outskirts of the city. "Good morning, Asia," said Florentino as he met his brother officer, whom he was to relieve. Then jokingly, "Didn't catch Lively yet, did you?" "If I had, you'd have heard all about it," returned Wilson, laughing. Just at that moment, the 2 officers heard footsteps nearby. The mantle of night had not yet released the city from its folds. A man approached. He was short of stature. As he passed along the sidewalk within 3 feet of the officers, he noticed them and quickened his pace. Florentino looked at Wilson in quick surprise, each thinking the same thing. "Did you see him?" he asked in amazement. "I certainly did. I think that's Lively." "So do I. Let's go," said Wilson. By this time the man was quite a bit down the street. He was too smart to break into a run, but he was walking mighty fast. The 2 officers hailed a passing automobile. They would use the car, they decided, because if it was Lively, he would be taken off guard as he had just seen them on foot. Florentino and Wilson raced down the street in the automobile and directed the driver to draw up abreast of the suspected child slayer. Wilson jumped to the sidewalk for the purpose of identifying the suspicious pedestrian. No sooner had he done so than the man, who most evidently was Lively, drew a gun and shot the officer through the right lung. Florentino then leapt out of the car, picked up his brother officer, and placed him in the car. Before being rushed to the hospital, Wilson, seriously wounded, gripped Florentino's hand and gasped, "That's our man, Jim. Now you go and get him." Lively, meanwhile, had dashed into a park which skirted the street. The place was dotted with trees. Florentino, who had left his gun in the car in his excitement, ran into a nearby house, borrowed a shotgun, and then plunged into the darkness, hunting Lively. It so happened that the gun the officer had borrowed contained but 1 shot. He knew he would have to spend the 1 shot well. He prowled about the murky park, and finally, about 6 feet in front of him, he saw a figure moving behind a tree. An instant later, a bullet whistled past his car. Lively, who had more nerve than a dozen ordinary men, had stepped out into the open to fire the shot. Quick as a flash, Florentino aimed and fired at Lively before the man had a chance to get behind the tree again, but his single blast went wild. The policeman was in a devil of a predicament. Here he was, only 6 feet from a murderer who was loaded down with ammunition, while he himself didn't have any shot left. But he never thought of running away. He knew that if he did, Lively would guess his lack of ammunition. If Florentino attempted to run, he would probably have paid for it with his life. So he decided to stand his ground and outwit the man. He shouted to Lively, "Listen, Lively, I'll stand right here and shoot at you all day if you don't surrender. The shots will attract attention in a crowd, and when that crowd finds out who you are, they'll tear you to pieces. If you throw away your gun and surrender, I'll save you from the mob." This was a fast bit of work on Florentino's part. Lively didn't answer for a moment, and then a few seconds later something thumped on the ground. Then from Lively, "There, I've thrown away my gun, I'll come with you." And so Lively surrendered, and the manhunt, which had had us all baffled for 5 months, was over. Officer Florentino commandeered a second vehicle and took Lively to Vineland Jail, where he was docketed and locked up. He was then taken from there to Bridgeton and placed in the cooler. I walked in after he'd been there for a few minutes and asked him if he knew who I was. "Yes, you're Mr. Parker," he said. "That is who I am, Lewis," I replied. "Now, only yesterday the grand jury found a true bill against you, charging you with the murder of Matilda Russo. Do you want to tell me about it?" "Yes, sir." So Lively told how he'd lured Matilda into his house with the promise of giving her some pudding. He admitted that he had sent his wife and son away the week previous so that he could be alone for the murder. When Matilda came into his house that Saturday evening, he struck her over the head with a club. She yelled feebly, and then he struck her again. Then he removed her clothing and mutilated her. He'd hidden her in his house all that day in preparation for his crime and had put the finishing touches on Matilda's grave. After the completion of his ghastly, terrible crime, he buried the child and her clothes, burned her shoes, and then otherwise proceeded to cover up his tracks in the way which I have already outlined. He stayed around the house after the crime, he said, because he was satisfied he had foiled us. But he decided to get out of town that Friday following the murder after he'd sneaked home the back way and found the door nailed. He knew then, he told me, that we were on his trail. His motive for the murder, he revealed, was that he hated Matilda because she had fought with his son, little Louis. The prisoner then further admitted that when he decided to come back to New Jersey, thinking the affair had blown over and desiring to see his relatives, he dressed as a woman and took a Jersey Central train from Jersey City to Bridgeton. He had the colossal nerve to arrive in Bridgeton in the middle of the day. He said the conductor on the train looked at him rather sharply, but then passed by. I was a little nervous when that conductor looked at me, Mr. Parker. I thought my woman's makeup was not perfect, Lively said. Arriving in Bridgeton, he went to his sister's house, but she slammed the door in his face. He then went into hiding for a few days. He never did tell us where he was going on the morning he was caught in Vineland. He had discarded his feminine attire after having vamped a truck driver into giving him a lift. He said the truck driver suddenly suspected that he was a man and ordered him to get off. Lively showed absolutely no remorse after shooting Officer Wilson, who, although close to death for several days, fortunately recovered. I released Mrs. Lively as she was innocent of any direct connection with the murder. I knew she was innocent from the first, but she was arrested because I was convinced that Lively would communicate with her. Lively was tried for the crime, convicted, and sentenced to death in the electric chair. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Kalish, one of the most learned and high-principled men I have ever known, was the presiding judge. I have heard Justice Kalish sentence murderers to die in the chair. Sometimes it has seemed to me that he was doing so against his own scruples and merely fulfilling his duty. But when he sentenced Lewis Lively to death, there was a note in his voice that I interpreted to mean that on this particular occasion he was more than glad to fulfill his duty, as outlined by the verdict of the jury. The tragic and gruesome story of Matilda Russo's murder might end here, except for one more interesting incident. After Lively's conviction, and the night before he was to be transferred to the death house of the New Jersey State Prison at Trenton, where he was to settle his debt to society, the warden of the Mount Holly jail rushed into my office. "Lewis Lively insists upon seeing you," he said. "Well, what does he want?" I asked. "He won't say, he just wants to see you, says it's important." Knowing so well that Lively was a killer of the first order, I became suspicious. Instead of going to see him, I ordered a search made of his cell. There, my associates found a sharp instrument which the man had made after being incarcerated. It was shown to me, and the next morning I went to the doomed man's cell and spoke to him through the bars. "We found a shank in your cell last night, Lewis," I said. "Did you plan to kill me with it?" "Well, sure as hell I did," was his brutal reply. "You're no better than the rest of them, Parker." This incident will give you a better description of Lively than I could ever picture for you with mere adjectives. On the night of his execution, I was one of the witnesses in the death house. I've seen many executions, and I have been responsible for sending many men to their death. Sometimes I have felt a lump in my throat when seeing a man I have tracked pay his penalty. But when Lewis Lively was led into the dimly lit death chamber, I felt no qualms of conscience. As I said before, he was the most desperate fiend I have ever encountered, and when the prison doctor pronounced him dead, I breathed a sigh of relief. I hope to never see his like again. And that is the grim conclusion of Ellis Parker's A Cry from the Grave. Until next Thursday, I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.
If you like the show, please subscribe, review, and tell your friends. You can find us on social media at Kinda Murdery or email at kindamurdery@gmail.com.